chiseled in stone, which doesn't wear away very often, but still.
Stone helps. It's a sadness. I mean, I enjoy history. I enjoy elements of archaeology, and you hear, like African history, and how much. I mean, they didn't have stone in many of those places. You had things made out of wood, but the understanding, there were some major empires and things like this, but there's nothing remaining that we are able to dig up, if that makes sense. And so much more being found in South America, in Central America, in those jungles and things that are just, and nowadays with these satellite systems and stuff, I was like, there might be something there. We ought to go look, and wow, there's something there.
And my daughter was able in college to go to Costa Rica for a couple weeks. And just stayed at the Howler Monkey sanctuary. I forgot what it was called. But people there took them out, and they were talking about it. You see that mountain over there? It's not a mountain. It's probably a temple.
Yeah.
And the jungle's just taking it out.
That is a sobering reminder that give it time, the earth tends to reclaim.
And I remember I wanted to ask you, this was what, the Sunday that we were all at, had the class after church. You know about John, Jaars. Where is it? I do know. It's the Wycliffe place, Bible translators, and the Jars thing that supports missionaries. Anyway, on that campus they have the Museum of the Alphabet. You've been there?
No, we've talked about it. So that's one that I want to go. I'd like to get there and visit at some point, just like the Museum of Language, which is in Washington, D.C., and that's in our list of places to want to go.
It's really interesting. It's right there on the North Carolina, South Carolina border, and I've been there a couple of times. It's really fascinating. They take you from hieroglyphics, symbols, pictographs, hieroglyphics, and then Arabic letters, alphabet, Hebrew writing, Greek writing, all of that.
Yeah. And we see some of that, even as we're talking here. Some of these, just because of the amount of time we're seeing in these conversations, the development of things like the Roman and Latin and Greek and some of these kind of things as in these conversations that we're having. Well, that'll bring us for today, because today we're going to focus on Athens. And I kind of tried to figure out how I wanted to order some stuff. I played around a little bit of reordering a little bit. But Athens is central to so many things. So we've kind of gone through geography, and then we've gone through sort of those empires, big picture, so you have a little bit of feel for some of the things that were moving and the different entities, and then we talked about some of those really, really, really ancient ones. Ending with Mount Olympus last week. Let's look a little bit about Athens, both ancient and a bit modern. Because so much of this, I'm sure you've had, if you remember any of those classes, some of them are just names. We don't want to spend a huge amount of time, but when we start saying, how did it influence the world of that era? At some point, it's not just a name. It's not just a historical name, because the things that they chose, the things that they did, the things that happened, the people that were there, rippled. I mean, they really ripple through history. I mean, how many people in the United States do we really remember from 200 years ago? Or 150 years ago? In terms of history, I mean, certain industrial magnates, certain politicians, certain military leaders, but you think about that. Now, imagine if you could take and just shift out another 2,000 years. And how many of those names would still be high in the list? But that's who some of these names are that we have in some of the people. So these are some of those interesting things. This is just sort of, as I said, name dropping. Places and people. The Areopagus, it's a location, it's a place. Solon, a person. Thespis, where we get thespians. You know, the beginning of the whole story of the first recorded elements associated with theater. Pericles, hugely influential, politician, builder. You'll see his name come up when we get to the Acropolis. Darius. Now Darius was Darius the Mede, Darius of Bible, Persian kind of area, but his influence on what was happening around things like Athens. Marathon, not that far away, and that whole story of running the marathon. Phidippides, each one of these Xerxes, all these folks. Again, we might simply say, who are they and we don't know, but if we're familiar with history, these pop out. Let's start with that. I love just the imagery. This was a photo we took there we're on top of the Acropolis. This is looking a bit west-ish, and if you actually see, this is a body of water out there. So Athens is kind of in an area where you've got a body of water this way, and you've got some stuff, you've got another body of water there. One is the Gulf of Solon, the other one is the Gulf of Athens. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, I have to take a look again. And then what you have up there is some of these different elements. This we'll get to is that's not the Parthenon. That is one of the other buildings, but it's at the same time frame, it was built the same. But I just love that sort of, not sunset, but the setting sun gives a beautiful view. That's an upward view as you're rising and walking up the mount area associated with the Acropolis. So that's looking up at the Acropolis. And the entrance, the Acropolis itself is both a mountain, and then at the top there is this sort of mostly flat-ish platform upon which is a whole bunch of other stuff. It's really huge, but just a beautiful view. Now here is where we want to spend a bit of time. This is, again, I did not take that because I did not have the kind of gadgets to do it, but I think it's a really, really good view of the Acropolis and the area around it. So at the top we've got the Parthenon, we've got some zones we'll get into, that's the entrance area. Down here, one of the theaters. Down here is another theater area. Over here you can see some historical things you can't quite see, but over there is one of the stadiums that we'll talk about. And you can see where this thing just rises up, these pretty sheer areas. So this was, the last area, when they say Acropolis, it was a fortress. It was also a temple. And it became that center of Athens. But it's also not just the Acropolis. Look around. The city around it. This is downtown, smack downtown Athens. What do you see, what do you not see? What's noticeable? Anything?
Well, the map of where the volcanoes, wherever those things are, popping up in the middle of town.
Yep. Yeah, you've got another map that one's actually a little bit taller than the Acropolis, and there's another church kind of cathedral thing.
This is like a park area here versus area behind it's more urban.
Yep.
But there's another park over to the right, and another park out there. It looks like far out to the left.
Yep. What you might also notice is the level of the trees. They're moderate, but they're not huge trees. I mean, these are the height of the trees is a little bit lower, of different kinds. This here?
That's the theater.
This is one of the theaters. We'll get into that in a minute.
Where, in relation to ancient Athens,
yes.
Where was the city wall?
City wall.
They all had walls.
They all had walls. The big question is kind of like if you've ever understood Jerusalem, which time period and which wall?
Okay, that's what I'm asking.
Because what we will find is that if we look at roughly 1850, we'll hit to this on some of the timeline, what the population of Athens was in the 1800s, versus what it was in 500 BC. I mean, you had big, and it was doing this. I mean, hugely different. And they did have massive walls. You had massive walls further out here in the 500s. And then they came in when it was overrun and it was all torn down. And it was built back up and it came back and forth. And they didn't have any walls. And at some point, walls were no longer useful. So it's amazing to see over that period of time. Jerusalem is interesting because now if you go to Jerusalem, you've got what they see now as the city wall. They call the Old City.
Yeah.
But you realize that old city is from 1,000 years after Jesus, where that wall is at. The time of Jesus, you go in, you know, and they didn't have the wall. They had a wall, but they didn't have that wall. And you realize going back towards the mountain, stuff like this, with, you know, the Solomon's temple. So it's all interesting how these things got built out over different times.
Well, what's the population in 500 BC and Acre?
Best I know, let's hold that because part of that gets into let's get some of the imagery and then we'll go through because otherwise we'll get individual questions. I don't mind, but let's hold that.
I bet it was MMX. I bet.
I mean, that's built on a rock outcrop.
Yes.
I mean, they just built it up there. They didn't tear it down around it. They just built it on top of it.
Right. And you can, if you were up there, you can see it is native, I mean, natural rocks. I mean, it's not like it's not been filled. So it didn't build up and then fill in. I mean, it is, you're walking on solid rock. And
It was always there.
It's just always there.
They didn't bring anything in. It's not infill.
Not except, you know, in certain areas to once they get that wall, but I mean, and basically the basic structure, I mean, you can see that rock, it's just, that is rock, solid rock.
How far below that theater? I mean, is it?
Oh, wow.
In terms of depth, it looks
It
low.
looks small now. It's not small.
Probably, if I had to guess, 300?
Okay, it's a good distance.
Yeah. When you're approaching in, you're parking, there's a parking area down here, and this is the walkway. You're walking from here, and you can, it's hard to get a whole scale of height, but you're walking this path.
Okay.
Or you're coming in this way. And so once you're here, this is a rising path, but it's walkable. Then you end up getting steps, and your steps here, and then your steps there, and your steps here, and your steps here.
Yeah.
That right there, I don't have a good picture of it, but that's probably a 25 or 30, that's probably a 30-foot rise right there of just steps. Steps and a little platform, flat pin. And you start to realize, yeah, if you were doing that as a defensive measure, I mean, you're just going straight up into that. And it does rise, as you can see here. It's still a slope. There's no way. A few other things that are important here to note is that there's very few very tall buildings. So
That's right. I was just not, they're not skyscrapers.
Now, there's a whole history of the White Houses with the orange roofs. We'll kind of get into that because that wasn't there until a certain time period, and by law, they established what they wanted to have. But what they also had is why you don't see the big tall buildings is the laws that they have associated. At one time, it was a maximum of 3 stories. Then it became a maximum of 5 stories, and they got some areas where you can do some more. But they didn't want to lose the skyline. They didn't want to have a New York. So you can't build those kinds of. Now they got some areas that are more over here that do have some more height to them and stuff like that. But and it just stretches. I mean, that's a huge city. So we'll get into some of that as well. What we do have is some of these are important. So there's 2 of these. This is the Herodium, or the Odeon of Herodias. That was Herodias Atticus, 160, 170 AD. He built this huge theater as a memorial to his wife. Yeah, a little investment. Memorial. 3-story. I don't know if you can see. This is 1, 2, 3. This is actually below ground because you can see this steps in. So this is sort of under. This is about 1, 2, 3 from there. 4,680 seats. That is a big stadium even now. It was destroyed in 267. So he built it, and it was there for, give or take 100 years. Solid stone, and then it was destroyed by German invaders when they came through. And, some of it was gone, some of it wasn't, some of it didn't put back, but some of it they just left as it was. It was partially restored in the 1950s. And one of the reasons it looks in good shape is it is now used for modern concerts and things like that. So just like a lot of these other ones, they say this is a great place. When we were in Ephesus, they were setting up for a concert in the great the bowl version, their theater version in Ephesus. So they do the same thing here. This other one, it's harder to see it because it's not in as good a shape. There's another one right over here. That was the Theater of Dionysus, and known as the birthplace of Greek tragedy. So this one dates to the 6th century BC. 600 BC is a smaller theater in that area. But at that time, and it grew, so it's kind of small, but we said if he built it in 600s, give some time. How do other people deal with stuff? How do people keep adding on? Some new emperor, some new things. So, Sophocles, Aristophanes, Euripides, all of those folks performed in that theater. Those famous names. The seating began with wooden bleachers, continuously expanded. They added in multiple levels. They added in then stone seating, different areas. First recorded major improvement was up to 17,000 seats. The second major expansion put it to 25,000 seats. That would have taken up all of that area.
So basically, back right up against the Parthenon.
Yeah, and you use that because when you go up the slope, you're not trying to build up, you're just working your way in.
Right. I wonder what the people in the back row can hear.
If you're out there now and you're having a concert, the way it bounces, and it's interesting, wonderful acoustics. They had people that understood some of those acoustics. So you do something like that, and the way it comes in its natural bowl shape. It was deconstructed, repurposed. Some notables in that, in the 5th century AD, there was an orchestra area that was the circle in front of the stage, became a courtyard for a Christian basilica. So there was at one time, down in this area, there was a sort of Christian church. But you just take thousands of years, ups and downs and builds and rebuilds and invaders and trash and take it all apart and put it back up again. This is a different scale. Now we're moving from the photo. So you saw the Odeum of Herodias. That was the scale on the end of that thing. Now again, you had the stoa. The end of that stoa was this huge thing here, but you can't see it now because it's not really there. That was the size of that Theater of Dionysus. And then they had the Odeum. There's all these things. That gives you a sense of the scale. Here we have the entrance areas coming up to the Parthenon. Parthenon Way went all the way around. You have the Temple of Nike where you started to come in. But these are some of the things that we get into. So one of the first pictures that I showed you was what's known as the Rexeon. That was the one that had the sort of the sunset over it. Parthenon is here. You have the Sanctuary of Zeus, Sanctuary of Poseidon, or Pandion, excuse me. There's not as much left of this. These have bits and pieces. This has got parts of it are still standing, and this has got parts of it. As we get into that, does anybody remember why the Parthenon is only partial? Does anybody know? Well, there were earthquakes, but that didn't really cause the problem. So what's going to come out of that is when we look at the Parthenon is people. People either being intentional or stupid. So eventually it survived for thousands of years. It's huge. As you start to get close, you start to realize just the size of those stones, and it was made to be able to withstand earthquakes, and it did. Until you had a particular war, when you had two different fighting groups, and it was the era of gunpowder. And somebody decided to use the Parthenon to store munitions. And the story goes, it's not quite sure whether it was intentional or accidental, but somebody else managed to fire cannonballs up that bounced into the Parthenon and into the munition storage and blew it up from the inside. Whether that was intentional or accidental is an interesting question. Parthenon, massive scale. That was a downward looking view. That gives you a little sense of scale. That was the theater, the first one. That is looking down into the Dionysus theater from above. So one was over here, this one's down there. So you can see this is just remnants. That's what we've got left of this massive one. This is looking out over the city. This is more eastbound. And you can start to see the scale. You've got bigger buildings, and again, over this way, the port area and stuff like this is further this way. But you do have bigger buildings, and then you've got these hills in the background, so it just goes right up to those hills and peters away. You've got some other ancient, this is a temple of Zeus that was there. Beautiful view. This is the Rectheon. These, you can't really see the detail. It'd be hard, there's so many neat things. These are known as the Karatas. There are 5 women carved, and they're huge. I mean, people, when you get back to this, you're going to see people who are like this size. They're all walking towards the Parthenon. And there's a whole interesting story about how they're walking, what the angle is, and there's political dissing between who's representing this one and the different cities and Thebes and Sparta and stuff like this, and how they're walking and sort of paying homage to the Athenians, and you want to, how do you insult your neighbor? Those are 30-foot tall statue of Athena, not these, but inside here, there was a 30-foot tall statue of Athena. You might have heard it from history. She was carrying a spear. The point of the spear was burnished gold, and gold and bronze and stuff like that for different pieces of it. The tip of her spear, if it was catching the sun, could be seen from 60 kilometers away. 60 kilometers is about 40 miles. You could see it from the mountains to the southeast out into the water. All depends upon the angle of the sun, but you can catch that glint, and the size of that spearhead was enough to be able to pick that up. There's your Parthenon. Massive scale. This building was 70 meters by 30 meters. That's 230 feet by 100 feet. So 100 feet across, 230, and you can start to see, as we're away, you can start to see just the scale of people that are up there. It's under continuous level of renovation. They've done a lot to try to put things back. You still have the arguments you might hear about the Elgin marbles and some of these things, where Elgin, the British guy, came in and first he was saying he just wanted to make copies of them, and then they disappeared because they took them back to the British Museum, and then all these people got mad, and that's what I'm going to look at. What it's interesting is his argument at the time, which gets nobody up there cared. Nobody was looking for it. You had pollution and things like this that was degrading some of it, so part of his excuse was nobody's paying attention to it, nobody's doing anything with it, I'll take them back and protect them. 100 years later, somebody might have them back. They're really ours. We'll give you copies of them. And so all that kind of thing. But there's a whole interesting story of how this was totally neglected. And they didn't care. But there wasn't anybody there to care. That gets back into some of what was going on. So what we have with this is this there's illusions, there's neat illusions that the architectural design, there's virtually no straight lines. They look straight, they're not. These bow out in different interesting ways, and they lean. They can lean in slightly. You can almost kind of see it here, because the way your eye processes it. Otherwise, it would, because especially if you're low, it starts to stretch out. So when they stretch it back in, it makes you think it looks straight.
That was built that way, didn't it?
No, it was all built. I mean, the Greeks knew what they were doing. There's a certain bowing there and stuff like that. And some of that's also how does it spread the weight. These ones on the edge, you can actually see that one. That one is not.
And you can see that.
It's a little bit of the camera, but not much. It's actually leaning in. You just don't notice it on this side. But that, again, when you start thinking of what they didn't have is big flying buttresses, right? So this did this put the stress out a little bit. The fluting, you can see the little fluting, these things, the little lines, that's the fluting on it. The fluting deepens as it rises. Because otherwise, at the height, if this is 100 feet across, this is like 60 feet high. It disappears. So they got it bigger at the bottom with bigger spacing, and as they went up, the spacing got smaller and the fluting got bigger, so that when you looked at it, it looked like it was the same. Which means
They set all the rules.
every single piece of this was being custom cut, custom carved, to be able to follow all of those things that the designers are putting into it. Just neat. Well, the whole thing ended up being a social statement of Greek superiority. They wanted to show that Athens, was bigger than Sparta and Thebes and these other city-states. Over time, it served as a temple, a treasury, a Christian church. From the 6th century to the 15th century, it was a Christian church. They just put a Christian church in there. Which kind of was the thumb in your nose at the Greek and Roman gods. We've taken over. You're not here anymore. It was a mosque for the 15th and 16th centuries. They took it over and said, no longer yours, it's ours now. In 1687, you notice I mentioned 15th, 16th century? 1687, you had the Ottoman-Venetian War. That's what happened. The Ottomans were using the Parthenon. They owned the area. They controlled it. They put the Parthenon, and they put gunpowder storage for their cannons. A Venetian cannonball bounced in, exploded, and blew everything out from the inside. 3 of the 4 sanctuary walls collapsed. 3/5 of all the friezes fell, meaning the columns fell. What they've been doing ever since when they started rebuilding and stuff like that, we can get into it, they've been going through and trying to figure out what everything is and numbering. Their team has been numbering every single fragment. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle in reverse, trying to figure out where does it fit. All these
Or
different
taking
pieces.
down an old log cabin and you number the floors.
But in some cases, they're all over the ground. It's kind of like, where's that one go? Where's this one go? Oh, that one seems to fit.
Have I seen pictures of the understory of that as well?
I don't know. You can't go in. That's blocked off. You can see all the scaffolding. So I don't know how much is underneath. I couldn't answer that question for you. That's a little bit closer.
Are they literally trying to rebuild the columns all the way around?
Their intent is to do whatever they can. You can see all of these other parts that are all lined up, and it's remnants. And you can see certain areas where they have come back and they've had original, and then they have new material.
Let's say they're trying to rebuild it.
Yes, and the science to it is really tricky as well, because in some cases, like some of these other places, they've tried to rebuild it. Well, they just tried to rebuild it with, say, like concrete and steel or iron bars. Well, regular concrete and iron, it starts to react and it rusts and it can actually cause more damage. So they're doing it slowly, but the technologies that they have to try to use different kind of materials, different kind of binding agents, things that will ideally be less likely to damage what they're trying to save. Tough
You
questions.
go back and do what the Greeks did.
But originally it was all stone.
It's all stone.
All
Yep.
stone.
What you will see in some of these, and we'll see some examples earlier or later, for some places they did have inserted iron sort of joinery. you're familiar like how people do cabinets with joinery, so you'll see blocks, and you'll see these all over the place. And in the middle of between two blocks, there's a piece of metal which is stuck in like that. Because what it does is it keeps the two blocks from moving. So when you do have an earthquake, they do this, but they don't do that. But, as we'll find out later, depending on what's accessible and what's not accessible, people say, oh, there's iron. Iron's valuable. We take the iron out of this whole thing and melt it down and make weapons out of it and stuff. This is an image from Mars Hill. So if you remember, Paul shared his message about the unknown God on Mars Hill, the Areopagus Hill. So that is the Acropolis. There's a little bit of a drop, so it doesn't go all the way down to ground level. Ground level is way down here, but it kind of comes down and comes back up. But this is not. This is rough. This is just natural stone. They did have buildings of some kind there, but it's not near as big and stuff like that. But the Areopagus was from mythology, it was first a temple, and it was the place where Ares, the god of war, was placed on trial for murdering Poseidon's son. That's the mythology of the Areopagus, which is where it gets to Ares, Areopagus. And it's also that famous speech that Paul had from Acts 17. And in that pre-classical era, 5th century BC, it was the meeting location of the Athens Council of Elders. So that was sort of like the Roman Senate, or some of the things that we have, which would be high public officials. They would gather there at the Areopagus. They would make their decisions about what was going to happen for the city. And in classical era later on, it just became the home for homicide trials. So it kind of carried on that sense of this is the trial and judicial issue. This is a neat place. This is the Parthenon Stadium. This is not on the Acropolis. Acropolis is sort of, I think the Acropolis is sort of that way. You might be able to see a little image of it. That might be a little part of it over there. What do you notice looking at this stadium?
Very modern.
Chariot races.
But it's modern. The floor looks like to me you can build over the top of it, put a floor over the top of the building. But it's saying it goes down to a lower level.
Yeah.
Well, not a lower level. I guess that's a track, right?
It's a track. Yep. You can see somebody on it. So that is the size of a person sitting. That's the size of a person standing.
What do they do there?
In the 6th century BC, it was a simple race course.
What?
Race course. They could race. Horses, people.
Chariots and things.
It would be kind of small to try to do chariots. It'd be tight for these kind of corners.
Sure.
So you probably wouldn't do chariots there. But you might
That's
be able to try.
still quite a turn for a horse race, too.
In the 4th century, it became the home for the Pantheonic Games. Pantheonic. We're going to get to the Olympics. This is going to be the connection. In 144 AD, it was rebuilt for 50,000 seats. Now, you were asking questions about how big was Athens. So in 144 AD,
They had
you had a stadium for 50,000 people.
So big.
And for the theater that we were talking about, 200 or 300 BC, you had a great big theater place that held 25,000 people. That's not trying to put everybody in the city. I mean, this was a huge city. In its area.
You know, I was just thinking, that thing, I didn't ask the question, but I was just thinking back. The workforce to build these things had to live somewhere.
Yeah. Athens, I mean, you had these city-states. You had Athens, you had Thebes, you had Sparta, you had Corinth, some of these other ones. And then it turned into smaller, villages and stuff, but they were the ones, like eventually ancient Rome, it gravitated there, and that was the power. It was also the safety. You get outside of that, and who knows who might come in and raid you and stuff like this. But you also have to think, just like any other big city, just like we have now, how do you feed it? Where is the incoming, because as you get bigger, it cannot sustain itself with things like agriculture. It has to be importing and drawing. So this is an area we'll get into, it's called Attica, and then Athens was the capital of Attica and its region, but everything there is then supporting Athens.
That's a small people, do all that back
Oh, I mean, the organizational structure and what they had, the sophistication of their administrative state, at this point the administrative state was just phenomenal, both in terms of the Greek and then the Romans. One of the reasons the Romans were able to expand as they did was the efficiency of the, they were one of the first, so you take a look at Mongols and a bunch of these other ones, you'd have some big, war chief, and he'd go running around, but the ones that stuck around, the empires that stuck around, were the ones that figured out logistics. How do you support different armies? England, Germany, Egypt, here. How do you support a city of 1 million people like Rome? And realizing that you have to have never-ending foods coming in, and waste getting out, and people doing things, and communications, and the Roman roads, and the communication systems, and the standardization of the language. Everything's going to be in Greek. Don't care. We do it all in Greek, so we all know it. All of that comes into play in these ancient empires, and they learned that, and that's been passed on. What's interesting about this in a different way, it was abandoned in the 4th century AD, and it was excavated and rebuilt in the 1800s with less seating. That is not your 50,000 seat stadium. That's the small version. And it's the site of the modern Olympic Games. But when they did rebuild it, they were consistent with one thing that they wanted to do and keep historically as accurate as they could, so they rebuilt it, and there was stuff there, but they rebuilt it. That's all marble.
Oh my goodness.
It is the only all marble stadium in the world.
I guess so.
Marble. It's a bit hard when you're sitting on it, but it will, if somebody doesn't come in here and intentionally destroy it, it's going to be there for another 10,000 years.
Bring your cushion.
That's a lot like it.
How did they do
You can
that?
imagine getting that marble in there.
Yeah.
I guess it's carved on.
It's, you can see, you got different, it's carved in, and you have different kind of slabs and everything else, and all these, you can see, if you look at it carefully, you can see these are blocks and everything else.
But of course, this is what shouldn't weigh in. But we think a lot of the stuff we do today is great, how we build things.
You didn't have power tools. You didn't have pneumatics.
You didn't have power tools.
You didn't have hydraulics. They understood in some ways how you could use water to lift things and do stuff like that.
But carving was by hand or by,
Well, they were master.
Yep.
How did they get those big stones to build
the
simple? How did they get them?
Different places, different things. So they certainly understood issues of leverage. I mean, that's, your Aristotles and whether it's the philosophers and the ones that were doing their Pythagoras and
Science,
engineering.
mathematics, and
And you see-
philosophers,
A lot of geometry.
and,
A lot of
and
geometry.
storytellers, and, it was a very civilized.
They built, I know they talk about the pyramids, they built ramps to take it up.
That's the best we understand, and you start
So
saying
they
how you
didn't
get
have
some of those
cranes,
things.
they had to get it up high, so they built a ramp.
Kinda
And
like
we
when
went
they did the
to,
pyramids,
there's
everything.
a place
Yeah.
in, New Mexico, where is it, New Mexico, Arizona? It's a, where this, and you can still see this is a
Oh,
mountain.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
And you can still see the ramp or parts of it. And this was probably about the same time, but probably later than that. But they built a ramp so they could get up to it.
So you have ramps, you have there's a guy that has actually done this. There's a guy here in the United States, I think he's in the United States, and he's played around with somewhat smaller but still big versions of how you could do this with a small number of people. So getting a huge block and just levering one end of it, getting it up like 6 inches, and you put wedges under it, and you get the other end, and you get it up, and you get that one, and you're just doing this.
Okay.
That's an example. You might have seen some other places where if you can get them on rollers. So you get them on rollers,
That's where stone.
and then you're using like olive oil to be able to lubricate, to be able to take great big blocks and slide them and roll them on the rollers. It's effectively a whole series of wheels, almost like how a
You
tank
just
moves.
move the rollers as you go.
And you just keep moving the rollers. When we were in Israel, I don't know where I've got a picture of it, it was interesting to see how they move some of the blocks and how they would, in some cases, move bigger blocks and put them on almost like a dowel kind of a thing, roll it, and then you could shape it afterwards. So you could almost roll something and then come back and reshape it. There's just all sorts of different techniques. Some of it depends on how big it is, how far it's going. The water, if you were bringing in, now there's huge quarries that are not too far from here, so you can see where they were quarrying it. In other cases, you've got some quarries that are a long way away.
I want to ask one silly question.
Mhm.
What are the bathrooms?
Wait till we get to Ephesus.
Okay.
We'll have a conversation about Athens. I have a photograph of an ancient bathroom in Ephesus.
Okay.
Modern Athens.
For me, that's
For
mine,
me.
for me.
That's roughly the size of Atlanta.
Now, Athens is that big?
Really?
Athens is that big, 1,000 square miles?
Modern
The metro
Athens.
area, yes.
Whoa.
1,131
I had
square
no
miles.
idea.
This is the overall Athens metro. Now, if you're familiar again, to try to give a city of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta is this tiny little
Right, it's
thing.
just like Boston,
That's-
it's tiny.
But what is Atlanta? It goes for 100 miles on either
Okay,
side.
so that's the metro area.
That's the metro area.
Still
So
big.
when you saw from from the top of the Acropolis, you're seeing that metro area, and you realize you got some other pictures that just keep going. And you're like, wow, that is
But the
huge.
1,000 square miles is still big.
Yeah, 1,000 square miles is what is that? You figure, okay, you're roughly,
300, 400, but what's
if one way to see is
4 by
you're
4? No, 3 by 3, probably about 3 by
about
3.
35 by 35.
Yeah.
Gives you a rough square.
Yeah.
But it's not a square because you get the mountains and stuff, but that gives you a rough idea. Finish up with a few little thoughts, because we've got more about Athens next time, because we've got even more ancient, but also some more modern stuff. Capital, largest city of Greece. The human presence for Athens goes back to somewhere between the 11th and 7th centuries BC. The first evidence of that, now it's before the Acropolis and such, but that comes back to the first human presence, they have evidence of that. It's in a basin surrounded by these hills and mountains, so a lot of things. If you're familiar with some place like Los Angeles, some similar issues. But it's also that sort of basin rolls right out to the Saronic Gulf. The Saronic Gulf then gives you that opportunity to be able to get straight to the water. Yep, seafaring. If you need it. Here's some little statistics you were wondering. Metro area, currently 4 million. In the 1820s, 200 years ago, the population is estimated to have been 4,000.
Oh, okay.
All clustered at the base of the Acropolis. This was after the War of Independence, trying to get their independence from the Ottoman Empire. 4,000. Small country.
But they,
Everything, now you had stretch, but I mean, that was the population of Athens, and it was all right around the base of it, and it was decrepit. And if you read some of the histories, there's some fascinating histories. Lord Byron from England, he went there, and he was in the 1800s, and he wrote some stuff about his trips there, and squalid conditions and stuff like this, but he loved Greece. He ended up being part of the history of becoming actually a patron for their War of Independence and stuff like this. Interesting things. Some of that was going on. 1950, the population was 1 million. So in the space of 130 years, it went from about 4,000 to 1 million. Just huge. And this was not population growth inside. I mean, it was growing inside, but it was people moving, and for all the different reasons. But you had a different stability, and you had things that happened. They got past the war. By 1960, the population was 3 million. In the space of 10 years, the overall population of the Athens metro went from 1 million to 3 million in 10 years. And the reason that happened was they had a civil war. Civil war in that 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and people were refugees.
Who fought who?
It was internal, it was a civil war between various, and we'll get into some more of the history on that. And then you had the Hunter later on, but you had an internal civil war. And when they did that, and all the fighting that was, a lot of the fighting was up in the middle and north and stuff like this, and so you had people, they just moved to Thessalonica, and they all moved to Athens, and everybody cleared out of the rural areas because that's where everybody was fighting, and it just, but when you had 2 million people try to move into that city in the space of 10 years, what happens?
It's amazing.
That place for them to live.
Where do you live? How fast can we build?
Right, that's what you're saying, you gotta.
How fast can we build? What kind of infrastructure?
slums,
You don't have
very
jobs.
slums.
You have effectively, so you have cheap, as fast as possible, low quality. You had issues with unemployment. You had issues with services.
Yeah.
This became a whole problem, but that's what a civil war does. It tears, everything is torn down. You don't have the infrastructure in place to support everybody. That's all part of what happened with Athens. So you end up having that dense city street layouts. Most buildings 4 stories or less. We'll save the rest of this for next week. But that gives you a little glimpse, and we'll get more into the timeline for Athens and some of that stuff next time as well, because that's going to
Do
be.
it next week, because that's Holy Week.
Oh, that's correct. I have that as announcements.
And then
Everybody get out.
and then-
We are not meeting next week. We got Holy Week, so it's.
and we missed the next week, because we'll be gone.
Ah, well, hopefully we will record that and you'll be able
And we'll
to
go
watch that
on
later.
and Watch it, okay.